are Tony Stark's parents really? The answer to that question is more complicated than some might initially think. Welcome back, Nerd Squad, it's me, Amanda. Today we answer this question and more as we unravel the complex and secret origins and history of Tony Stark in this attempting to explain video. How do you feel about secret origins in comics? I personally have kind of a love-hate relationship with most secret origins and retcons myself. For Tony though, let's start with the narrative that most people are familiar with from the comics and similarly the MCU, before diving into the deep, dark secrets of the Stark family tree. Tony Stark is the son of Howard Stark and Maria Stark. Howard owned Stark Industries and actually helped his father, Howard Sr., to build the company. From a young age, like Tony, Howard was known for having a brilliant mind, excelling in engineering. He would grow up and end up working with S.H.I.E.L.D., joining them on many missions and aiding their efforts. As a wealthy man, he would also gain access to the Hellfire Club, but was more a member because he enjoyed their parties apparently, as opposed to being aware or aligned with any of their political beliefs and more sinister pursuits. Eventually, Howard would meet Maria at one of his casinos in Monaco. He would return a lost earring to her and help her escape her own bodyguards, who didn't seem to actually have had Maria's own best interests in mind. Not as much is known about Maria's life before she met Howard. What we do know is that she was a socialite and a philanthropist who was born into wealth in Southampton, New York. When Stark first met her at his casino, she was in an unhappy relationship with Obadiah Stane. She went to the casino with the intention of losing copious amounts of money, and this is basically what got her roughly escorted out by her own bodyguards, whom she and Howard would later defeat and of course escape. Maria and Howard would fall in love and later be married, going on to become the only parents that Tony would initially ever know. But Howard and Maria Stark weren't the only parents that Tony would actually have, or at least would later learn that he'd ever had. Tony, it turned out, was adopted. Learning this later in life, it would be revealed that a Hydra agent and S.H.I.E.L.D. agent were actually his two biological parents. One of them being Jude. Jude was a Hydra agent who went undercover at S.H.I.E.L.D. Really though, he apparently had no allegiances, believing both agencies to be problematic in similar ways. Jude was more interested in serving his own interests and profiting off of playing both sides. Jude would meet Tony's birth mother, Amanda Armstrong, a singer who was also working as an undercover agent for S.H.I.E.L.D. while on a mission. The two fell in love and began a relationship, with Jude often traveling to faraway places throughout the course of their few years together. Amanda became pregnant, and shortly before she was due to give birth to their child, Amanda's life was threatened, and then Jude's life was threatened, and Amanda learned of Jude's true beliefs surrounding Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. He suggested that they run away together, but unwilling to accept Hydra's money or their protection, Amanda attacked Jude and then ran away. She gave their baby up for adoption, and that was how Tony became a Stark, adopted by Maria and Howard. In fact, the name that the Starks gave to their baby, Anthony, would actually come from Amanda herself, the name that she actually wished her son to have. Amanda had asked Nick Fury to make sure that the baby ended up in a nice and safe home, but Nick basically disregarded her wishes, following the standard S.H.I.E.L.D. protocols instead, which had the baby end up in an orphanage. Howard heard of Amanda and the child and ended up choosing to find and adopt the baby, with him and Maria keeping the name Amanda had picked originally. Years later, when Tony learned the truth of his parentage, he would seek out his biological parents and meet Amanda. After falling into a coma, Jude would also resurface in Tony's life, attempting to capture his son. Despite the fact that Jude had died years earlier in his fight against Amanda, or seemingly died, Jude in fact had been alive most of the time, having been resurrected and returned to life by Hydra and remaining in their employ all these years. But while Tony was the only known child of Amanda and Jude's, he was not the only son of Howard and Maria Stark. In fact, before they adopted Tony, they actually already had a son. Maria and Howard, after being wed, struggled to conceive a child together, and when they finally succeeded, it appeared the life of the unborn was threatened. As a result, they searched high and low for any possible way to ensure that the baby was healthy and that the birth was a success. When Howard learned of an alien being, a Rigellian recorder known as Recorder 451, he brought together the Stark Seven in an effort to free the being. After succeeding in rescuing the recorder from its captors, Howard and Maria discussed a way that the recorder might be able to repay them. 451 revealed its plans to help advance the human race so that they would be protected against alien threats in the future, and eventually usher in an era of universal peace. Recorder 451 noted that their unborn child was actually the perfect specimen for this effort, and Howard and Maria were reassured by this when they learned it would also ensure their son's survival. However, Howard would later learn that in modifying the baby to make it more resilient, 451 had also added in kind of like a kill switch. Nervous about this, Howard secretly concocted a bio cocktail to alter the modifications with the purpose of removing said kill switch from the mix. After the birth of their son, whom whom they named Arno, 451 left Earth, but Howard's tampering with the modifications done to his son ended up resulting in young Arno becoming fatally ill shortly after being born. Fearful of 451's possible vengeance, Howard hid what he'd done in order to protect Arno. Howard and Maria hid Arno away in the Maria Stark Foundation, keeping his existence a secret. They then adopted Tony around the same time and raised him to believe he was actually their natural-born son in order to prevent 451 from getting suspicious should the being ever return to Earth. Howard did record a message for Tony to explain Arno's existence and the truth of his own birth and biological parentage. However, after the deaths of Howard and Maria, the log remained buried for many years before Tony eventually did learn the truth. Arno was initially the lost brother that Tony had never known that he perhaps secretly wanted. Also a genius, as he was modified by 451 to be as such, after Tony learned of Arno's existence, the two would often team up and work together, combining their brilliant minds. Arno would become an ally of Tony's for a time, while Tony hadn't known of Arno's existence until later in his life. From the safety of his hospital bed and iron lung, Arno had actually been monitoring and watching Tony's progress as he grew up. However, while the two were initially friendly and brotherly towards one another, eventually they would be at odds with one another, with Arno becoming delusional and somewhat villainous even. Bruce Banner would trick Arno into helping him in a fight against Tony during Original Sin, and later Arno would choose to betray his brother, allying himself with rival company Banetronics in secret. Tony was made to believe that his body, completely engineered at this point, was more akin to AI and robots than humans, giving Arno the ability to delegitimize Tony as a human being, taking away his rights, his property, and his resources. Arno would become Iron Man, believing that the AI threat known as the Extinction Entity was on the rise. Tony would ally himself with the AI and their right to free will, because, at that point he felt he was more alike to them, and then the two brothers would clash. Eventually, it would be revealed that the Extinction Entity was not real, but merely the result of a delusion on Arno's part. While Arno at this point had believed he had healed himself fully of his fatal disease and effectively removed any flaws from his genetic code, the truth was he was actually still on the verge of dying, as 451 had initially programmed to happen to Arno in his prime. Seeing this, Tony trapped his brother inside his own armor and put him into a stasis. The suit acted as a life support system, while Arno's mind was submerged in a virtual dream, where he believed he had defeated the Extinction Entity and was celebrated as a hero. As Tony grew, he would develop a close and loving relationship with his mother Maria, while struggling to establish a strong connection to his father Howard. This was actually due to the fact that Howard and Tony had very different temperaments, and the fact that Howard turned more and more to drink, making him much more abrasive and causing him to often mistreat Tony. Howard also liked to meddle in Tony's love life and affairs, preventing him from pursuing many of his romantic interests growing up. However, it was later believed that this was done out of a sort of strange kindness, with Howard seeing it as protecting his son. While Tony would think his father was never really proud of him, those close to Howard felt kinda just the opposite, that Howard actually really loved and respected his son and therefore tried to do everything in his power to protect him. Howard and Maria would later perish in a car accident on the Ides of March, but it was later believed that this was no true accident, but a successful assassination attempt on their life. However, it's also been suggested that their deaths were faked and that they could even still be alive today, with Howard confessing prior to his supposed death that the Shield of the Brotherhood had plans to use a car accident to fake their deaths. Following the death of his parents, Tony would inherit and run Stark Industries, create a charity in his mother's name, and would eventually go on to become the hero we know as Iron Man. Iron Man in part was also an identity that was inspired by Howard in a weird way. Howard always had a phrase he'd repeat to Tony that Stark men were made of iron. When Howard was cruel towards Tony, he escaped in tales of fantasy, growing up with the stories of King Arthur and the armor-adorned knights of his round table. Tony fantasized about creating a man made of iron. But while Howard and Maria profoundly impacted Tony and his upbringing, there was another super influential figure who acted as a caretaker for him. Edwin Jarvis, the family butler, and possibly someone who has influenced Tony's life even more than his parents, as Edwin outlived them and continued to serve Mr. Stark following their deaths. Kind of a similar relationship to Batman and Alfred, really. Jarvis became the butler for the Stark family after serving in the British military during World War II, and despite him having a British accent, he may not actually be British by birth, but instead an American who traveled to Britain at a young age to serve in the war and then developed his accent there. Although in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he does seem to be pretty OG British British to me, so I think he's just straight British over there. Edwin Jarvis was influential in Stark's life from a young age. When Tony was young, he had a pet dog named Leo who passed away. Tony was emotional and heartbroken over this loss, being only a boy at the time and honestly, understandably upset. Howard berated him though for his displays of emotion. Jarvis, however, did not, and instead encouraged Tony to express his grief through other means. Tony would use his emotions as fuel, inspiring him to create brilliant inventions. Jarvis has sometimes been relieved of his duties as a butler, forced to resign as a result of injury or of issues with the Avengers, but has always eventually returned to service. Fun facts: he's been brainwashed into becoming an ally of Ultron, posing as villain the Crimson Cowl, and at one point was implied to have a relationship with Spider-Man's Aunt May during her stay at the Avengers mansion. Iron Man's family tree does not end there. While never married, Iron Man has had many romantic relationships throughout the years, though honestly too many paramours for me to list here. That is best saved for its own attempting to explain the widespread dating life and history of Tony Stark. Tony also has an extended family, including his uncle, Howard Stark's brother, Edward, and his cousin, Edward's son, Morgan. And he also has a grandfather that we've known of, Howard's own father, Howard Sr. Isaac Stark Sr. has also been mentioned as an ancestor of Tony's. Happy Hogan, Pepper Potts, and Rhodey are also all close allies to Tony, who I would consider to be like family to him. While Tony doesn't have any natural born kids in the main reality of Earth 616, you could say that the progenitor who appears during the AXE Judgment Day event is kinda like his offspring, as Tony helped to create the man-made Celestial using his own nervous system as a blueprint in the Celestial's construction. During the King in Black event, Tony also found himself bonded to a symbiote known as the Extrembiote. And finally, there is some weird timey-wimey stuff in his family tree. During the Marvel event The Crossing, Tony was revealed to be a sleeper agent for Lord Immortus, aka a version of Kang the Conqueror. In order to defeat him, the Avengers got help from a younger version of Tony who would later become time displaced and actually take over for the original after he died. This would later be reconciled, however, when the younger Tony was combined with the former older Tony Stark, blending the two together to make them one entity, the true Tony Stark. So yeah, that's also a weird part of his history. Arno also created AI robot versions of Howard and Maria Stark known as Arsenal and Mistress. They ended up agreeing to be uploaded to the virtual dream that Tony put Arno's consciousness in order to prevent Arno from realizing that this was a virtual reality and not real life. I'm sure that will never backfire. Oh boy, that's gonna backfire at some point. That's all the time we have for this video. If you want to learn more about Tony's extended family, his romance history, or the timey-wimey weirdness of The Crossing in a future explained video, let us know in the comments. I'll see you next time, but until then, you stay nerdy, YouTube.